Hello and welcome to the 5 p.m. Saturday panel of the Deep Valley Book Festival. This panel is called Not Quite a Kid, Not Quite an Adult. So what we're going to do now is turn it over. My name is Kirsten Cron-Mills, and I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Becky Brooks.
Hi, and thank you all for being with us today. And we would just like you to introduce yourself so that our listeners can get an idea of who you are, where you live, and books you've written that they might be familiar with or want to read, and anything else you want to add. So if we just maybe go Margie, Kathryn, Jerry, Selma, in that order, if you'd introduce yourself, please. Thanks.
I'm Margie Preuss, and I live in Duluth, Minnesota, where it is now fall. And here's my books. And I do want to mention especially my 3 new books in 2020. So those would be Village of Scoundrels, based on the true story of a French village in World War II that sheltered many hundreds of Jewish children. The Littlest Voyageur, about a red squirrel who stows away in a Voyageur canoe. And coming October 6th, the last of the Enchantment Lake mystery series, The Silver Box.
Thanks.
Pass it on.
And I'm Kathryn Sullivan. I write young adult fantasy. I live in Winona, Minnesota, where it keeps changing back and forth between summer and fall at the moment. I write young adult fantasy, short story collection, both fantasy and science fiction, and The Crystal Throne, which is 2 kids pulled into a magical world and asked to break a curse. The sequel will be re-released pretty soon, I hope. That's basically it at the moment.
Okay, thanks. Jerry?
Okay, I am Jerry Hines, and I'm from White Bear Lake, Minnesota. I'm retired now, which got me into doing my writing. I have written 5 books, and 2 of them are for young readers. My first one is Silly and Stinky Stories My Grandpa Tells. Anybody that wants a good laugh that's a young reader, that's a good book for that. And I've also written Searching for Raven.
Jerry, you're muted.
Yeah, Jerry, something happened to your audio. Would you mind repeating what you said after Searching for Raven?
Oh, there. Let's try it again.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. Anyway, I finished with, you did hear Searching for Raven?
We did not.
Okay. This was my second book, Searching for Raven. And I'm just glad to be with everyone. I'm not sure how much you heard of that.
That'll work for now.
Okay.
Thanks. Selma?
Good morning. I'm Selma Parody. I am from Bloomington, Minnesota. I have written 2 different books. One is The Hard Way, which was published in 2017, which is a coming-of-age novel, high school theme. And then I will be publishing my second book in November, and it's called Sean's Way, and it's the sequel to The Hard Way. And I'm also glad to be here.
Awesome.
Great.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for that. The first question that we need to address in our panel is a pretty traditional question, but it's one we all need to know the answer to, and that's, why do you write for middle grade and young adult audiences? What draws you to that audience? And I think in the order, let's go Margie and Kathryn, and well, yeah, let's just go Margie and Kathryn and Selma and Jerry.
Okay. Well, I keep a little sticky note attached to my computer or near my computer that is a quote from Graham Greene that says, "There is always one moment in childhood when the door opens and lets the future in." And that is pretty much what I want to write and why I write for kids, is that moment when the door opens and lets the future in. Of course, I want to write that moment when the door is open. And I'm also aware that for many children, books are doors that let the future in. So I do take the responsibility of writing for that age very seriously. I'll just leave it at that. So I
Kathryn?
think it's
For
Kathryn.
me, yeah. Well, for me, it's basically, when I started reading science fiction and fantasy, when I first started writing, I was 14. So it's always that sense of wonder. So I tend to write more middle grade and YA because I like exploring the world through my characters' eyes. And I like exploring the hopeful world rather than the cynical world of adult. So I tend to write that age.
When I started writing, I was thinking about it when I was a teenager. And I always had those diaries, you know, the little book ones with the little clocks and the keys come with them. And I always had some ideas about wanting to write. Then I watched my kids and I watched my kids' friends grow up together and just the things that they went through and things that they experienced. And so my writing started to become about that age group, because it really intrigues me how they come across their journey and what things and challenges they come across as they're navigating, growing up, and becoming young adults.
Okay, is it me now?
Mm-hmm.
I have always worked around kids, and I've always gotten to like that middle age group kids, and that's what started me writing in that group. My grandkids, or my kids at first, were always looking for a story from me. So as they were growing up, I would tell them stories and gave me ideas for writing. And then again with my grandkids, I did the same thing, where they wanted to hear stories and I'd tell them stories. And eventually I took a couple of those stories and put them into actual books. So that's kind of what got me going.
All right.
Great. Thank you all. So the next question we'd like all four of you to answer is, how do you begin a story? And we want to know that because young writers so often ask us that question. So do you start with a character? Do you start with a problem, a situation, both? What's the kernel for your story ideas that launch you? And let's go backwards this time. So Jerry, start us off, and then Selma, Kathryn, and Margie, please.
Okay, that's a good question. A real interesting one. Do you have the characters in your mind, or do you have an actual story in your mind? Well, for me, it's usually one of these stories or one of these ideas that I talk to my kids about, and I try to take that idea and build it into a story, and then add my characters to it. That's generally how I've done the two young reader books that I've done.
Great, thanks. Selma, how about you?
For me, it starts off with an idea. It starts off with an idea that I'll sit down and I'll actually journal about. And I'll write a bunch of different ideas out with that idea and let it flow out to become a story. I also kind of put my stories together in pieces. I don't usually start with an outline. So I'll maybe be writing the middle of a story and then adding to it as I'm building it from kind of the inside out per se. So yeah, so I usually start with an idea and build my characters into the story.
Great, thanks. Kathryn?
I tend to start off with a character. Sometimes I saw a picture in the newspaper, or I am biking around and notice something, some location, and then figure who's there. but it usually starts off with the character.
Great, thanks. Margie?
I'm glad I'm last so I could listen to everyone else, because I feel like, oh boy, whenever it gets into anything about process, all I can say is it's just messy. It's messy. I don't know. It can be any little idea, a little an image, a thought about a kind of a character, but I do feel that I don't really know my characters until I've really written quite a bit. They start revealing themselves to me over the course of writing, and it isn't until many revisions in that I feel like I really am getting that character. And I would say that is one fun thing about a series, this mystery series that I've written, is that you already know the characters. And it really helps in terms of getting started. And I think that's one of the hard things about writing, is just to accept that you don't know everything that's going to happen. You don't really know your character that well. You don't know the twists and turns your story might take. And so just be okay with that. And like Selma, I don't write in order. I don't necessarily start at the beginning and go to the end. I just write what happens here, I guess, and just be okay with that. It's all going to come together eventually.
Great, thanks.
I'm actually going to ask a follow-up question to that, and that's about first drafts versus editing. And that's partially because I'm in that process right now. So do you prefer, or do you have feelings, maybe is the way to ask it, do you have feelings about getting it all down in the first draft and you like that process, or do you like the editing process? I have very particular feelings about that, and I'm just wondering if anybody else does as well. But that just falls under Margie's "it's messy" heading. So let's go in order of Selma and Kathryn and Margie and Jerry.
That's a very interesting question, and it's making me think about what my process is. And usually what I do is I get a draft down, and it is messy. It is completely messy, and it may not be all in order yet. And the order kind of comes together as I go through different revisions. For the hard way, I had my final revision, my final published revision was revision 14. So I'm going through multiple revisions to get to that final book. So that's how I go through my process.
Kathryn, how about you?
Well, I try to get as much done as I can to start off, but a lot of times, of course, things interrupt. So I'll go back and edit part of what I've written to get me back in the mood for writing the next scene. Mm-hmm. And like you've said, it is messy. So sometimes if I'll get stuck on a scene, I'll jump ahead to another scene and then try back and reconnect it. So just trying to get the first draft done as best I can. And then realizing I'm going to have to edit it again once I've got the first draft done.
All right, Margie.
Yeah, I feel like first drafts are long periods of agony punctuated with extreme joy. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you hit something and it's like, mm-hmm. Oh, I got it. Mm-hmm. But they're never, ever, I don't think, joy all the way through. Unless you're Stephen King, apparently, who claims that's the case. I really enjoy the revision process. That's where I shine. I tell kids I'm not a very good writer, but I'm a pretty good rewriter. Because my first drafts are really terrible, and I hope nobody ever reads them. But I'm good at seeing what went wrong and what I should do better next time. And I kind of feel like revision is like laying vellum paper over and adding. Like, I guess like a painter will go in, and for those of us who aren't artistic, I didn't do that. My son did that in high school.
Beautiful.
And he comes home and he says, oh, I never finished that. Like I need to do, and so I think with painters, they see what's not finished. And as writers, we have to see what's not finished.
All right. Thank you. Jerry.
Well, I have to agree with all of you. Seems like you've covered all the points on it. For me, the biggest thing is I want to start revisions before I finish that first draft. It's like I want to have perfection as I'm going through it. And it's really hard for me. I've talked to writers who have written for a long time, and they will say, don't do revisions, just write your whole story. And I just can't get myself to do that. I write and then I want to fix it and then I want to add and I want to, instead of writing right through. So I'd like to get better at just writing that whole first draft and then going back and saying, now I can revise it. So I'm still working on that.
Excellent. Those are great answers. And I think young writers will really appreciate knowing that all of us have different processes and that it's really a mess sometimes. It's really, really a mess. So thank you all for allowing that deviation from our plan. We'll get back to the plan now. And each one of you now has an assigned question. So the first question is for Kathryn. And the question is, are YA trends due more to publishers' reactions, meaning what publishers want, or the reader's interest, meaning what readers want? And how do we tell what that is? So Kathryn, I can't wait to hear your answer to this.
Well, it depends too, if we're talking YA, if we're talking middle grade. YA, those kids can buy their own books at that point. They are no longer dependent on the gatekeepers, librarians, their parents. So YA, those trends seem to fixate a little bit on dystopia a lot. Middle grade though, what I'm loving to see, the fact that we're getting a lot more diversity in there.
Mm-hmm.
The fact, and that could be due to the gatekeeper saying, oh, we need some more diversity, or not, because the trend so far seems to be a lot of mythology, and not just mythology of Greek and Roman, but we're getting a lot more of Africa, we're getting a lot more of Caribbean, we're getting a lot of different cultures, Southeast Asian. And with the Rick Riordan Presents, we're getting a lot more of different cultures. And that's lovely to see because, there's only so many different ways you can see Greek and Roman. But that again is due to the parents, the grandparents, those people who buy the books. With YA though, it's a lot more open because you're actually getting the feedback right away from those people purchasing the books.
Very good. Thank you. That's a great answer.
Our next question is for Margie. And this question is, what makes YA actually YA? What defines something as young adult literature or middle grade? And what's the distinction? And how important are the distinctions? And do you keep that in mind as you write? Or does it blossom and then you decide?
Well, I hope I'm not supposed to answer that question. That was my question to everybody because I don't know the answer. And I actually do wonder because, well, for one thing, little story. I have, the Minnesota Book Awards are coming up. And my editor of my publisher for Littlest Voyageur submitted this one to middle grade. And I asked my publisher Abrams if they would submit this one to YA. And they said, oh no, that's middle grade. And I said, okay, well, what is middle grade? Because and what is YA? Because I thought YA was like 12 to 18. And the protagonists, there are several in this book, are 16 and 17. They're based on real people who were teenagers during the war that, rescued these kids. And so they're older, they have to be a little bit older. There's one 10-year-old, but 16, 17 years old. So I thought, And 7th and 8th graders are where they're learning about World War II, right? So I thought it was YA, but no, my publisher says, no, that's middle grade. And so I'm just in this like, what? And I also know that, and I talked to a bookseller who said that she shelves some, not all my books, but some of them both in middle grade and YA. So, which I appreciate, and I hope all the booksellers do that. But I don't know. I don't know the answer. But except that I think that maybe YA is more, a little edgier sometimes, deals with, it's not so much the writing, I think, it's the subject matter. So it's like teen issues with, you know, current contemporary issues or just issues that older kids would deal with. But can I just read one thing I just read last night in this wonderful book by Philip Pullman? And he says, when we say this book is for such and such a group, what we seem to be saying, what we're heard as saying is this book is not for anyone else. And so he's arguing for doing away with divisions like that for subject, you know, for saying genre, not genre, but age levels. And then he goes on to say, it would be nice to read a review of an adult book that said, this book is so interesting and so clearly and beautifully written that children would enjoy it as well.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
I think that last is the perfect answer.
Does
Well, and
anyone add in on that? Go ahead. Sorry, Selma.
One of the things that they do say about the difference between middle grade and adult is that each of those age groups tend to read up. So so the middle grade kids want to read about things that are going on in high school because that's where they're going next. Young adult want to read about things that are going on in college or beyond because that's where they're going next. Otherwise, they're reading a lot about what they're already doing, which may or may not grab their interest. Is one of the things that I've heard for the difference.
Yeah. Can I just say one more thing? So these mysteries, the protagonist is 17. She's a senior in high school. And, but I think my readership is like 10-year-old kids, 10, 11. And because it's kind of a Nancy Drew situation, you know, older kid, she's in high school, but there really isn't anything in there that a 10-year-old can't, you know, a 10-year-old's parents wouldn't approve of. So maybe it's middle grade.
Other thoughts? I have one thought to add to that, and the idea of hope. I don't know whose phone that is.
That's mine. I'm just gonna get it off.
Okay. The idea that middle grade novels need to have more hope and more, not gentleness, but more, less darkness. Young adult novels can handle more darkness. I think that goes back to what you were saying, Margie, about 10-year-old parents, right? A 10-year-old's parents. You don't want middle graders to feel that darkness if they're not already. And when you start going through puberty, that's when that darkness kicks in. And so I think that's why it's more appropriate to young adults. Other thoughts about that?
On panels I've been at other conventions, a lot of times they'll say it's always the age of the protagonist. Yeah, so middle grade's more 8 to 12, and then YA is more 13 to 18, as Marty said. But I've also had people say, well, the YA always focuses on society, whereas middle grade focuses on family and friends. It's going to depend on the reader.
And I think that the distinction is always a mystery to us as writers as well as to everybody else. And I think it might be gratifying for the readers to know that. Just read the book you want to read.
Well,
I think we're just writing, you know, we write what we feel, what we are inspired to write, and where it falls, nobody knows.
Right. And I think, Margie, your tagline of "It's messy" pretty much covers everything that we're going to talk about today. So we'll just chalk that up again under "It's messy." All right, so this next question is for Jerry. How do you see creating a YA character and plot as different from how you would create them for an adult reader?
Well, that's, again, is a good question. I hesitated on getting in on the last conversation because I knew I had this question coming up. I've written a adult fiction book, and I've written 2 of the middle grade books, and they differ completely. And I think one of the biggest factors for differing, whether it's young adult or an adult fiction and middle grade, is subject matter and language. I know that when I wrote this adult fiction book, the language in it is not appropriate for middle grade readers. And the reason is people that read adult fiction, they want those characters to be the same as they actually are in real life. And if you're going to do that, you have to use language, or you have to use situations that that warrant that. Where in my young reader books, that language needs to be the same as those young readers are using, and the subject matter has to be that way. I think the biggest difference between those two, though, is the fact that adults want many characters. They want to know that they're what their characters are about. They want a lot more when they're reading than what the middle grade readers. They want to know the character, but they don't want so many facts that they get lost in it. They don't want lots of characters because then it makes it just too hard to follow. So I think as authors, we need to understand that as we're writing that. And that's probably what makes our books as good as they are for our young readers.
All right, thank you.
Okay. This is kind of jumps off that same concept, and this question's for Selma. Do you think or feel that writing for a younger audience frees you up to like liberate that kid within yourself, or do you feel like it limits you in ways like you have to be careful about language and careful about problems? So is it more freeing or is it more limiting? In what ways?
I think it's a little bit of both, actually. Through my characters, I've kind of gone through my teenage years again, it feels like, with writing about high school and part of the high school that I've set up in my books is the high school I actually attended. So I'm imagining those hallways, and I'm imagining the lunchroom, and I'm imagining those things as I'm writing. So some of it goes back to being able to relive it again. The limiting factors are only there because you don't, like what Jerry was saying, you don't want to get into writing for an adult audience when you're in a YA type of bubble. The other thing I look at with that is, now that I'm looking back at it, it's a 2020 look, to where I can kind of say, how would I mentor kids to kind of show them through the story how to make those decisions a little bit, things to look for. So I've been able to kind of open up to learn, hey, maybe I should have done that when I was a kid, or when I was going through that same challenge. So I think the answer to that question really is a double-sided thing, and it kind of creates where you're at in your process and how you write your story.
Thanks.
All right, some good answers, good answers from everybody. Now we have some free-for-all questions that anybody can answer, and I don't know the best way to do this except maybe to just raise your hand if you're going to answer, and we can all watch each other. So the first free-for-all question is, which middle grade or young adult author would you like to have a meal with, and why? Go ahead, Margie.
Well, if nobody else is going to go, because I'm just reading this book, and I love it. And of course his fiction as well. I'd love to invite him over and talk to him about all of this. But I also have a lot of friends who are writers who, if I only could invite them over right now, I certainly would. And that's one of the really great things about Minnesota, the Minnesota writing community, is how supportive it is. I think in the children's book world, the writing community is stunningly good. And we have some of the big hitters, and just so many people who are doing such interesting, wonderful work. And I think that we're so fortunate to live here. And then to have that community be so supportive of each other. I have said before that it's sort of like, Paris in the 30s when Hemingway and Fitzgerald and everybody were there and hung out at the coffee houses together. That's kind of the way I feel about the Minnesota children's book community.
I would agree with that. Kathryn, who would you say?
Diane Duane, because she wrote the Young Wizard series, and they not only are doing magic on this world, but they have world gates and they go to other planets. And she's been in Ireland for quite a few decades, so I'd also be interested in the Irish culture.
Nice. Anybody else? Jerry, Selma?
I'd like to invite Patterson over, because he's written adult books and he's written some young adult. So it would be interesting to pick his brain a little bit. And in reading his books, I've seen how he does transition from younger in some of his books to adult books. So it would be fun to have him over.
Yeah, my son really liked his young books when he was in middle grade. Selma?
Yeah.
I would have to agree with the Patterson thing for his young adult books and his older books. But the other person that I would like to really invite over would be Carolyn Keene, and pick her brain about her Nancy Drew series, because I'm a big fan of that. And I read all of those books when I was in my teen young adult age group.
Yeah. Good choice. Those are all great choices. How about if you want to share with the young writers who are watching this panel, or maybe older writers, where do you struggle in your writing process? And we may have covered a little bit of this already, but maybe you have other things you want to add in about what parts of writing are hard for you.
Well, I'm going to go back to the same thing that I said before. I write and then I want to fix it right away. And I think if you're going to be a writer and starting out at it, don't worry about what you're writing. Don't think about it. Write it and write it and write it, and then go back. And boy, if I could just convince myself to do that, I'd be a better writer.
Go ahead, Selma.
I think what I would basically do is, the issues that I usually have are time, and having time to fit my writing into my busy life with my family and my kids. So one of the big things that I would suggest is that you make time for it. So maybe you find that you've got time in the morning to sit down and just write, and not get worried about not having time or not being able to get it done, because it will get done. It just might get done in a lot of little steps instead of one big time.
I think that expectation of how much you can do in a day or an hour or a week or a month is that's a challenge for me, because I always expect I'm going to write, a whole bloody novel in a month, or a chapter in a day, or just my expectations for my ability to accomplish what I can accomplish are too high. So then, you're always a little bit disappointed. And I do cling to the, what Kate DiCamillo said. She says it, 2 pages a day. And so if I get 2 pages of anything, And I mostly handwrite my first drafts. So yeah, we could talk about that too, and why I think it's a good idea, but that's a different question. So, you know, you have to be realistic about what you can really accomplish.
Kathryn, how about you?
Every now and then I'll get that point where it's like, well, nobody's going to really want to read this. Oh, there's all these other people who've covered the same topic and they've done it so much better. Don't dwell on that. Go back and just say, well, I'm doing my own thing. I'm writing my own story and I want to see what happens. So it's moving past that.
Yes.
Good
Margie,
point.
very good point. Margie, do you want to go back and talk about that idea of handwriting first drafts? No, it's super important, and it's really becoming, it's a real resurgence right now. So I think
Oh, goody.
people want to hear about that.
Yeah, I compose much better on paper with a pen. And for years I thought, you know, oh, I should just do it on the computer because then it would be so much faster and I wouldn't have to transcribe it into the computer. But, and so I did try that once with a novel, and I ended up just starting over and wasting all that time and then doing it on paper. And if anyway, I wondered, you know, like, why do I have to do this? But then apparently studies show, and maybe everybody knows this now, that more parts of your brain fire when you're writing longhand on paper with a pen or pencil than on a keyboard. So apparently I need all the parts of my brain that I can possibly get. Yeah, and then I find that I don't just transcribe, rarely. I am also revising as I transcribe. So it is a step. It's a full revision step almost, getting those words, you know, typed in. And then I print those pages out and write on them again. So I just have to have that pen in my hand. I mean, it's not like I never do any revision or composing with a computer. I do, but I would say the bulk of composing is on paper.
Very good. Very good. All right. So the last free-for-all question is, what's your best advice for someone who wants to write? And some of you, I think, have already covered this, but feel free to add some more in.
Okay, I have one tip for those writers that are starting out. I learned this in a class a long time ago, and I think it's really important when you're doing some explicit writing. They would say, show, don't tell. I know you must have heard that before. And it took me the longest time before I even understood what that meant. And when I finally did, it really, really sunk in. We can, in our mind, see what a beautiful sunset looks like, and we can write down on paper that was such a beautiful sunset. But the reader, all they know is that you saw a beautiful sunset. When you show them that by saying the crimson reds melded in with the yellows and the clouds formed this or that, when you do that, that's what a reader wants to hear so that they can understand what that beautiful sunset was. So show, don't tell. That's my tip for anybody starting out.
Stephen King would say, read a lot, write a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
Selma?
My bit of advice is kind of dovetailed off what Jerry had said earlier. Just write. Just sit down and write. And what I usually do is I sit down with just a piece of paper and I just start journaling what I'm thinking about at that moment. It could be something as simple as looking outside and seeing the sun. You just start writing about the sun. Or you look across the room at pictures. Right now across my room, I have our bookcase. And I see pictures of my boys playing baseball. Baseball was a big thing in our family. And you just kind of keep going with that about memories and stuff like that. Before you know it, you've got 3 pages of stuff that you just wrote. And some of your ideas come from things you just see around you.
Kathryn?
And I'll add, be persistent, because when I first started writing, there weren't as many markets, but I kept sending things out and getting a lot of rejects, but I just kept sending them out. Nowadays, there are so many more opportunities for publication. You've got, yes, traditional publishers, you've got small press, you've got ebooks, you can self-publish without the stigma, don't go vanity press, no. But there's a lot more options. So it's a matter of just be persistent. Keep sending things out.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say, I would agree with, who was it that said read and write? The first thing, you really have to read a lot. I mean, you can't, as I tell kids, reading is the food of writers. If you don't read, it's like being a cook that doesn't like to eat food. You just, you have to know, you won't get good at writing anyway, unless you have a very solid background in having read a lot of things. And so you understand language and how it works and how stories are put together and how paragraphs work, and right down to, start a new paragraph when you do a quotation. I mean, those are all, that's kind of a silly one, but you learn a lot about writing just from reading. And then I kind of take that one step further and say, then, always read for enjoyment. But then if you really love a book, go back and look at it and see, what is that writer doing that made me cry? How did she do that? Or laugh, or just be unable to put the book down? Why? And study it. Study what the writer is doing to accomplish those effects so that you can do them too. I still do it when I am writing something and I'm having a little trouble. I'll say, what I really want here is I really want to slow the action down, and I really want I want some suspense, but I feel like I'm not getting it. Then I'll go back to books that I felt were very suspenseful in places, which doesn't mean scary, just like you just have to keep reading in this spot. And I learn from those authors.
Nice.
That's great advice.
It is. Becky,
All of you had great.
Absolutely. Becky, do you want to ask any questions or anything that you have to add?
I don't have anything unless anybody has a final comment or piece of advice you'd like to offer. These have been great conversations and wonderful insights, I think, into the work you do and how you live as a writer. So thank you so much. And for your openness and your honesty as well. So we definitely want to thank, do we need to close out, Kirsten?
I think we're good. Yeah.
Okay. So we want to thank Margie Price, Kathryn Sullivan, Jerry Hines, and Selma Verde for being with us today, and your openness and honesty, and Jerry's phone. And for our listeners, if you want to learn more about these writers and about their books, the Deep Valley Book Festival has an author directory at www.deepvalleybookfestival.com/author-directory, where you can find out more. And all day on Sunday, there will be programming from 10:45 until 5 p.m. With the Young Writers and Young Artists Contest Awards announced at noon. So thank you very much for being with us, all of you. Keep writing, keep reading.
Yes, thank you all for all the things that you do for young readers, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.